First, I want to thank Mara and Diana for the invitation to be here today. It's such a treat to be able to attend the summit and also to be present for the Scholar Weekend and hear everyone speak. Next slide. Culture trains, touring exhibitions, and moving libraries were practices common around the world in the mid-20th century, where information, artworks, and objects were moved around a country or across the world, whether as originals or reproductions, to disseminate knowledge and culture, most often by governments to share to sites where people wouldn't necessarily have access to them. In the 1970s and 1980s, it takes an explicitly political turn. Artworks donated in support of political causes were exhibited and toured in exhibitions or museums that were exhibitions or vice versa. These were not only displays of art, but were sites of solidarity where the public engaged with art in a different frame and in very different locales. International collections were built and toured around as precursors in anticipation of future museums. Today I'm going to speak a little bit more casually than sort of some of the previous speakers to talk about 4 of these international solidarity museums, but I'll try to focus more of my time on the iteration or the tour of one collection at the end. Here, this is a video. This is a practice that my colleague Rasha Salti and I do quite often, which we call mapping networks. And this is part of this. This research that I'm presenting here has been done in collaboration with Rasha Salti. Sorry, she can't be with us today. But this is part of a larger project that really began with finding a catalog for one exhibition, which I'll speak about. And as we slowly kind of looked at different names and pulled the thread, we ended up with a transnational project. We don't claim to be experts in any of these various sites, but we try to work as much as we can with different individuals to sort of feed in history and research into the project. In many ways, this research project is a tribute to these dreamers, to these artists, to individuals who imagined building projects and museums outside of traditional structures. They're alternative, these alternative museological formats, some have become museums today and some remain in storage, others have been destroyed. So it's also really important to acknowledge that these museums that have come out of very difficult political circumstances have a lot of emotion for the people that we've spoken to about these histories and still are very triggering, sometimes positive and sometimes negative for those individuals. Next slide. So I'll first speak about the sort of start of this research project, which began with finding the catalog of an exhibition, here of which there are 2 posters, one made on the left by Iraqi artist Dia Al-Azawi and the one on the right by Mohammed Malihi. You can see on the right side already the number of languages that this exhibition was trying to represent or present. And on March 20, and these are posters for the exhibition, the International Art Exhibition for Palestine. It was inaugurated on March 21st, 1978, at the basement hall of the Beirut Arab University in Lebanon. The exhibition was planned to remain open for 2 weeks, but was extended until April 25th, from what we can tell in a newspaper article. The exhibition was organized by the Plastic Arts Section under the Office of Unified Information of the Palestine Liberation Organization. So this was organized technically by the de facto government, which was based in Lebanon. And the idea for this exhibition, next slide, the idea for this exhibition was not only that it would be an exhibition of artwork donated by 200 artists from 30 countries just for display at one time in Lebanon, but in fact was meant to be the beginning of a future museum in solidarity with Palestine. Next slide. This is an image of 2 artists, Mishad Najjar and Jamil Sammout, who were painting the banner for the show. The participating artists, next slide. Sorry, I'm going to sort of interrupt myself all the time with the next slides. So this exhibition was only possible due to, the exhibition was in fact organized by the Plastic Arts Section headed by Mona Saudi, who's a Jordanian artist. She played a very significant role in the making of this exhibition, but also, as we can see in the acknowledgements page of the catalog, there were many other people that had to be thanked for their work. trying to organize an exhibition over a number of years in the context of a civil war in Lebanon by a de facto government in a different state in Lebanon was remarkable. And what drew us to the story is how this was possible, trying to understand the making of this exhibition. So when we look at the names, we see a number of people from all over the world, and this is these are our clues. And in many ways, this project was a work of forensics and trying to figure out who these people were if we didn't know them, and understand how they were connected to this initiative and what their roles were in making this project possible. Next slide. So as I said, there were approximately 200 artists from 30 countries that participated in the show. There were new names that emerged later in a poster that weren't in the catalog, and later as the years went by, more artists continued donating work. Don't mind the spelling mistakes. To imagine that they produced a bilingual catalog in the middle of a war is pretty remarkable. And I think this is, again, an attestation to the work they've done. Next slide. So here, when we look at the highest number of participating artists, they're from Poland, Japan, Italy, and France. So as we did our research, we asked why. Why were there so many artists, and what were the networks that they were a part of? Next slide. There were artists from the Soviet Union, but they didn't fit on the English page, I think, when they were designing the catalog, but on the Arabic side, you can see them. So that's also, you have to read through these documents very thoroughly. One of the figures who's really important in this project remains not very named. He's named in the catalog as he was acknowledged in the catalog, but the man on the left is Ezzedine Kollek. Ezzedine was the PLO's representative in Paris from 1972 until he was assassinated in 1978. And he was of the generation of PLO representatives around the world who believed in art and culture, spent time with artists, part of writers' unions, and here he is taking around the PLO cadre to tour the show. What's interesting is I'll talk about a couple of these other museums, and you see very similar images of you have the main cultural organizer with maybe the president or the sort of the head of the government taking them through shows. It's not an unfamiliar image, but to sort of see them side by side with many of the same artists being shown in these exhibitions is pretty remarkable. Next slide. Just play the video. So I'm going to distract you with this video of the catalog when I try to tell you some other stories. Coming back to this exhibition, which, as I said, opened in Beirut in 1978, the initiative was not only to have this exhibition, but for it to be a future museum. And this was, again, only possible due to the network that was built in building this exhibition, which I won't get to go into today, unfortunately, but can speak about another time. So the idea was that this exhibition would be able to travel, or the collection would be able to travel. And we know that they rented an apartment to hold the collection in Lebanon, just across the street from where the exhibition was held. And what happened was the same year, in June, 100 of the works were shipped to Japan. So I'm going to speak a little bit about Japan, but not in as much detail in terms of this story. The works were shipped to Japan because of a very close relationship between the PLO's representative in Japan, Fethi Abdelhamid, and an artist organization called JALA, Japan Afro-Asian Latin American Artists Association, which I'll speak a little bit about. 100 works were selected from the collection and were shipped to Tokyo, and the exhibition that these works were a part of, the translation into English is the Exhibition for the Restoration of Human Beings and Nature, which took place at the Tokyo Metropolitan Art Museum and was organized by JALA. A number of, one Palestinian artist, Mustafa al-Hallaj, was invited to attend the opening, and he participated in a conference where he spoke about art in Palestine. I'll speak a little bit about JALA just because, inspired by the previous panels, so I'm sorry if I take a little bit more time. JALA was founded by Haruyu Ichiro, a radical art critic, theorist, and writer who was part of the Afro-Asian Writers Union. It was established in 1977 to initiate artistic exchange and solidarity with the Third World, and was modeled on the Writers Association, which he was a part of. On the occasion of the biennial international exhibitions, which were entitled The Third World and Us at the Tokyo Metropolitan Museum, JALA invited artists to show alongside Japanese artists. Symposiums that they organized were central in developing discourse around anti-war, anti-nuclear, and anti-imperialist causes. They involved artists and intellectuals from countries such as Palestine, Korea, and Thailand, among others. And their relationship to Palestine is pretty remarkable. Jala's deep engagement with the Palestinian cause is quite complex and politically it's politically very complex as to how that happened and what was possible. But it was really it was individual relationships to the PLO office. And over the years, right after this exhibition took place in Japan, a year later, 11 artists in 1979, 11 Japanese artists were invited by the Union of Palestinian Artists to Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan for 3 weeks to see sort of firsthand, have like a witness account of what was happening to the Palestinian population. So this work, some of it travels to Japan. It returns to Beirut, from what we know. And in 1980, another selection of the collection was exhibited in Tehran at the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art under the title Art Exhibition of the Palestinian Resistance. You can see definitely a very particular selection of works that were shown, which all very much express resistance in one way or another by not only Arab artists but international artists. They were invited, artists were invited by the Writers' Union in Tehran to organize the show. Mona Saoudi, who was invited as well for the opening and was accompanied by the renowned Palestinian caricaturist Najir Ali. Artist Mustafa al-Hallaj, who went to Japan, also went, as well as the PLO representative in Tehran, Hani Hassan. The following year, some works from the Palestinian artists in the collection traveled to Oslo and presented in 2 different locations. The story sort of ends on a complicated note. In 1982, with the Israeli siege of Beirut, various offices of the PLO were targeted by the Israeli army, including those housing the Office of the Unified Information and the Plastic Art section, which contained this collection. The fate of the entire collection officially remains unknown, but it has been said that a number of the works were rescued before the building completely fell. Works were moved to several individuals' homes for safekeeping. The 40 works that traveled to Tehran remain there. It was sort of found recently that the collections remained in storage. They were never shipped back to Beirut because the airport was often closed around that time. So thankfully, there are more works saved. Palestinian artist Nasser Sumi, who was a part of this exhibition and was an assistant to organizing it, has undertaken the project of documenting and searching for the collection, which rightfully belongs to the Palestinian people. Next slide. The next museum that I'll talk about is in many ways one of the many geneses or inspirations for what became the International Art Exhibition for Palestine. And this is where Paris ends up being a really central node to this story. One of the versions of the story is that Claude Lazare, a French artist who lives in Paris, was very close with Izzedine Kollek. I'm sorry I'm throwing so many names out there that you probably won't remember, but this French artist, Claude Lazare, was very close with Kollek, and after he had donated a work for the Museum of Solidarity, Salvador Allende, he had said, why don't we do the same for Palestine? We can do it, we can bring these artists together. I'm sure the same artists will donate work. So this is one version of the story. Of course, Mona Saoudi was doing work in Lebanon and developing an international exhibition. So this is to say that many of these ideas for these solidarity exhibitions have strong connections to, they're artist initiated, and they have very strong connections to individuals deciding to take a position and make these projects happen. They're not organized by governments per se, even though the PLO was funding and organizing this exhibition. It was really the artists who made it possible. So the story of Allende is sort of two-part. The Museo de la Solidaridad was a collection of artwork that was organized once Salvador Allende came into power. There was a call for artists around the world to donate artwork in support of his social democratic win. And this collection of a museum was inaugurated in 1972. And just to sort of explain how that was possible, this call to artists organized by or written by Allende was only possible due and disseminated due to a network of, or thanks to a network of a number of individuals, in particular Mario Pedrosa, who was then exiled into Chile, or after that, he was exiled into Chile. Luis Aragon, Elie de Wilde, Carlo Levi, Jose Maria Moreno Galvan, and a number of others. In the coup in 1973, after the violent coup, the army ransacked the museum, destroying and stealing works and claiming the building as their offices. Fast forward to after the coup, when many people were in exile, a number of prominent exiles, including Miriam Contreras, Allende's former secretary, next image, which you can see her in the back left corner. Miriam Contreras, Allende's former secretary who had escaped to Cuba, Mario Pedrosa and Jose Balmes and Miguel Rojas Mix, who all fled to Paris, decided to launch a second call for artists to donate works to a new museum. This was called the International Resistance Museum for Salvador Allende. And so committees were set up around the world, in Paris, Barcelona, Havana, Stockholm, Helsinki, Mexico City, among others. And collections were organized, brought together, and shown in these countries, and sometimes collections would tour between countries as well. In 1990, after the presidency of Patricio Aylwin, the various collections were brought together and were repatriated to Chile. The Salvador Allende Foundation was instituted by a presidential decree and was assigned to the undertaking of this collection. The Museo de la Solidaridad Salvador Allende was re-inaugurated in Chile in 1991, and today the museum is a force of nature that's sort of trying to repatriate its own history. Next slide. The third sort of story of a museum in exile begins with two exhibitions, and the story begins in 1980, in fact, in Rome, at an art festival that was, or rather a festival that was was to commemorate the first anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution. There, Ernesto Cardenal, who is the renowned poet and minister of culture of the new Sandinista government, met with Carmen Vaux, who is a Chilean gallerist and cultural activist who played a major role in the International Resistance Museum for Salvador Allende. It was there that a museum of solidarity with the Nicaraguan people was born. Vaux spearheaded the project, and a year later, an exhibition in support of artists mostly in exile in Europe, and Spanish artists donated work. And here, this is the front of the poster for the exhibition, which took place in Paris in December 1981 at the Palais de Tokyo. The story of what happens with these exhibitions is that this was an exhibition that took place in Paris, another in Madrid. The works are then sent back, thanks to the Ministry of Culture in France, to Managua. And of course, the 1980s in Nicaragua was not an easy time to do anything, to do much. And I think it's also important to acknowledge the struggles that these individuals were doing in organizing these exhibitions from afar and then in trying to repatriate and bring them back. The collection was opened, it was operated, or it was shown in the Teatro Rubendario in 1982, and it was called the Museo de Arte Latinoamericano Contemporáneo de Managua. Over the period of about 8 years, from 1982 until 1990, the story gets very complicated and is something that myself and my colleagues at the museum in Chile are still trying to sort of sort out. Many of the press releases that sort of talk about the history of this exhibition or the museum are very incorrect, unfortunately. The museum in 1985 moved to a place called Casa Mantica, a private home, which was open to the public, and the museum was renamed Museo Julio Cortázar in honor of the writer. Cortázar, who had a strong relationship to Nicaragua, had talked in one of his books about Nicaragua about how this was probably the most remarkable Latin American collection that he had seen at that time. Many versions of the story in Nicaragua, and speaking to people, some people try to sort of put Julio Cortázar as the center of the story, and others try to sort of say that in fact there were other people involved, and often the female figures get not erased from the story but are not acknowledged. Next slide. And the last story, how am I doing on time? I think I'm well over. I'm okay. I'll just keep going. You just put your hand up. So the last sort of story that I'll speak about is the Art Against Apartheid, or Art Contre Apartheid. This also is an initiative that has a genesis in Paris, and it was inspired by the experience of the Resistance Museum for Chile. French artist Ernest Pignot-Ernest and Spanish artist Antonio Saura decided in 1979 to organize or establish a museum in exile against apartheid. The way this would exist, again, in a similar form, is as a form of an itinerant exhibition of artworks donated by artists which would incarnate their denunciation of the apartheid regime. Next slide. Pignot Ernest had been actively involved with the Brigade Internationale des Peintres Antifascistes, so the International Brigade of Anti-Fascist Painters, that had staged an action in solidarity with Greek dock workers when they refused to unload South African ships in the port of Athens. Antonio Saura, who had lived in Paris in exile from the Franco dictatorship and then in New York, had been an active member of the French Committee of the Resistance Museum for Chile. What partly inspired this initiative was in 1974 when Jacques Médecin, the mayor of the city of Nice, decided to twin the city with the city of Cape Town in South Africa. Of course, the city of Nice had a day designated to celebrate this twinning. In reaction, artist Ernest Pignot Ernest, a native of Nice, installed a large life-size drawing depicting a black family from behind barbed wires that would trail the sort of official celebrations planned for that day. Commenting on his action, Ernest Pignot said, "Immediately I dismissed the idea of depicting torture and violence, even though that's what was taking place and I wanted to denounce it. Something led me to think that the simple image of a family would be more impactful, communicating better what apartheid really was, and would speak more directly to the people looking at it." Next slide. I don't know if you can read it, but here are a number of the individuals participating in the project. So Ernest says, and I quote, this is translated from French, that in 1980 the project was truly born and developed the notion of bringing together a collection of artworks that were destined to become, through a world tour, one of the cornerstones of the denunciation of institutionalized racism, and then thus constitute a foundation for a future museum against apartheid. Owing the impetus to a small group of artists that joined the creators that were committed to their cause were those that thought that we were still to be convinced. We approached a number of American, European, and African artists. Our objective was to bring together the largest possible range of sensibilities, cultures, and artistic expressions. In 1981, next slide. No, go back actually. All right. In 1981, at the World Day of Solidarity with Political Prisoners in South Africa, they presented their project at the UN to the Special Committee of the United Nations Against Apartheid, who from the beginning were offering valuable support for the project. In 1982, the exhibition was properly formed, and it was one of the highlights of the International Year Against Apartheid. Next slide. So, a couple of these exhibitions. So the exhibitions traveled to a number of places. It first showed in France, in Paris, and then slowly moved, or not so slowly, but moved all over the world from 1983 until 1988. The cities or countries in which it traveled to were England, the Netherlands, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Spain, Greece, West Germany, Haiti, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and the United States. Next image. And here's oftentimes these exhibitions would happen, not only it would be an exhibition of this collection, but in fact there were panel discussions, there were sort of displays of what was really happening in South Africa, sort of like pictures and other types of representation. So it was certainly, these were all very political acts in many of the iterations of this exhibition. Next slide. So I'm going to end, or which is maybe what I should have spent the most time on, talking about the tour of this collection in Japan. This collection toured in Japan from 1988 until 1990, and it's the longest tour of this exhibition. Oftentimes when it traveled to these other countries I mentioned, they would travel to 1, 2, or 3 different sites. In Japan, they in fact traveled to 194 locations. 194 locations. And what's interesting is that the story for how it toured in Japan starts at a house party. It starts at a house party in Paris where a woman named Rei Maeda, who was part of the Japan Anti-Apartheid Committee, was attending a conference at UNESCO, the Anti-Apartheid Conference of 1987. And she was at a house party and met Jacques Derrida. Jacques Derrida was one of the members, or one of the sort of figures that was a part of this collection, or this initiative, the Artist of the World Against Apartheid. And what's interesting is, in particular with this project, is that you have so many writers that participate by contributing text. So you have artists giving work and you have writers giving texts, and these are printed in the catalogs. So she meets Derrida. The reason she meets him is a colleague or friend of hers, Satoshi Ukai, was studying with Derrida. She's introduced to him, and she had heard about this exhibition. She heard about the collection in the context of this conference. And so she spoke to him, and he said, you should really try to bring it to Japan. I know they've tried to contact different institutions, but no one seems to have grabbed it yet. And it'll be really interesting. In many ways, the story of the Japan research is it's very early for myself and my colleague. We've just had a few interviews with people. It was really through meeting one artist who gave us the Japanese version of the catalog that we were able to sort of understand that there was a very long story to look into. Next slide. So this is the cover of the Japanese catalog. And the story begins and ends in a way with Rei Maeda. She returns to Japan and she meets From Kitagawa, who was part of a publishing company, and he also was organizing exhibitions at that time. He was really impressed by the catalog, which looks like this, but the title was in English and French. He looked at the catalog, saw the quality of the artists, and said, we have to figure out a way to bring it to Japan. And so they also, what was really interesting, and their goals were quite particular and maybe different from the touring of all these other sort of itinerant collections. In Japan in particular, they fought and they worked for about 2 years, or a year and a half, to get authority to mount the exhibition not in proper museum spaces. They did not want to take them to national galleries, but in fact to take them to gymnasiums and non-art spaces, because they wanted to bring this work to the people. And this was very primary in how they decided to do this and how they were able to convince the secretariat, the committee in France, to allow them to do that. But part of that was trying to figure out how to ensure these works. Next slide. Oh, you can't really read it, but you'll have, what they had to do is they set up a committee in Japan. There were a number of different individuals, art critics, directors, activists, poets, and so they set up this committee, the Apartheid No International Art Festival. Next slide. And they had to figure out how since they knew they wanted to take this exhibition to not just one gallery or a museum, they had to figure out how to do it. And because, I mean, this is ridiculous, because it's Japan, of course, they figured out like how to build a truck. So in fact, so the truck had a name. The truck's name was Julia Pempel. It's the name of a character from a poem by Kenji Miyazawa. The truck was why this project was possible. And I think this is, in terms of itinerant museums, this is probably the most itinerant. They figured out different ways. They had thought about the number of trucks, sort of proper trucks that you imagine, shipping container trucks that they would need. They would need about 4 to take it around. But they worked because of From Kitagawa's idea, to build a special truck to transport the exhibition. The thing is, it was not just a truck to transport the exhibition, but it was for storage. So it was furnished with high technology equipment, it was climate controlled, and there were customized storage for every artwork. This is crazy. Like this, I mean, this is like remarkable to me. I don't know of any other sites where this has happened. And in an interview that my colleague Rasha and I did with Rei Maeda, 0 minutes, 2 minutes. I think it says 2 minutes. I'm almost done. In an interview that we did with Rei Maeda, she told us that the truck allowed us to unload the art to the exhibition site and install it in only a few hours. After the exhibition was presented, it was packed, reloaded, and moved to the next site. This meant a lot of unpacking and repacking, so they had to take a lot of precautions while moving the artworks. The exhibition, next slide. So this is the truck. There was a giant red balloon on top, so people could see it from far away. It was said that they wanted people to think like a circus was coming into town, like a way to really get people to attend this exhibition. From the research that we've done, the way it's been spoken about is that the tour of the show was political, but not overtly political. It was implicitly political. There were often times, and you'll see some images where they had these hammers and they would try to, they would stand with hammers and pretend to hit a wall of apartheid. And so this was, I think there were acts, but it was not, they wanted to bring students, children to see a remarkable collection, which I haven't shown you any images about. We can do it after. So this is the truck. Next slide. The first stop of the truck was Okinawa, and this was very intentional. And so it came into the port in Okinawa, and it made its way throughout the country over a 2-year period. So as I mentioned, the truck visited sites. Sometimes an exhibition was up for half a day, sometimes it was up for 10 days. So it was really arranged, and the structure and way in which they funded it is quite complex, but they were able to do it. The exhibition toured for a total of 500 days. There are 380,000 visitors who saw this exhibition. Next slide. So here, this is from the catalog. You sort of see all the different locations and the trucks, the truck kind of moving around. It's a beautiful sort of version of a contact sheet to sort of have a sense of where this truck traveled to and what it looked like. Next slide. So here, this is this wall with the hammer, which they keep doing. It's amazing. Next slide. And here's the map, which is probably illegible from where you're sitting. So just to mention, the truck was, I'll speak more about the truck in the Q&A if you want to talk about it, but the next slide, we'll just show you some images. So you can see it was often in gymnasiums and schools. There are different ways in which they displayed it around the country. And it wasn't one group from Tokyo kind of touring it around. They had to set up committees in every single locale, and it really was, this is probably of the most grassroots and projects that, of these touring solidarity exhibitions. You have a solidarity committee, you have an executive committee that was responsible for the show, but in fact it was only possible because the people in these sites, in these small towns, wanted to bring it. They had to find a way to bring it. Sometimes money from larger cities, they would donate the money to smaller towns to make the exhibition possible. So this, in Japan, this initiative seems to be a really remarkable manifestation of solidarity on a number of levels, not only through seeing the artworks that were donated by artists in solidarity with a cause, but by the organizers and the local organizers who made this happen. And this is, the last image. This is the last iteration of the exhibition at the Parliamentary Museum in Tokyo. And just to end the story of the collection, continue, next slide. Eventually, after the exhibition in Japan, they decide, as a gesture of solidarity again, to figure out a way to bring the collection to Korea. And they did this through an artist organization. I don't know much about it, but the tour after Japan is that the collection went to Korea. And after that, I believe it went back to Paris. After the end of the apartheid regime, the collection was brought back to South Africa, and it was put in the custody of the Maibui Center at the University of Western Cape. This image here is when the works were first shown in 1996 at the first session of Parliament of a Free South Africa. The collection here lives on the seats of the Parliament members. Eventually they went into the halls of the Wall of Parliament. Today the collection lives, as I said, at the University of Western Cape, but there's no museum that holds this collection. I'm going to stop here because I'm well over and we can continue later. Thank you.